In 2013, a little-known Chinese billionaire promised to carve a canal across Nicaragua worth $50 billion, 3 times longer than Panama's and more costly than the entire nation's economy. Overnight, a plan once favored by America returned, this time powered by Beijing. But today, it is nothing but rumors and empty land. How did a project designed to challenge US dominance simply disappear? The truth begins over a century ago, with a postage stamp and a geopolitical gamble. In the late 1800s, Nicaragua was the front runner for a canal linking the Atlantic and the Pacific. American engineers and lawmakers saw its route, with Lake Nicaragua at its heart, as the most practical path for global shipping. In 1850, the United States and Britain signed the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, naming Nicaragua as a strategic option. By the turn of the century, momentum seemed unstoppable. In 1902, the United States House of Representatives voted 308-2 in favor of the Nicaragua route. But in Washington, a French lobbyist named Philippe Bunau-Varilla had other plans. During a tense Senate debate, he circulated a Nicaraguan postage stamp showing the Momotombo volcano spewing smoke. Senators stared at the image and listened to warnings about earthquakes and eruptions. The volcano was more than 100 kilometers from the proposed canal line, but the fear stuck. Within weeks, the Senate swung to favor Panama, and President Theodore Roosevelt signed the Spooner Act, sealing Nicaragua's fate. For more than a century, the country's canal dream faded into the background, a casualty of lobbying and a single well-timed stamp. In June 2013, Nicaragua's National Assembly pushed through Law 840, granting an obscure Hong Kong company, HKND Group, the rights to build and control a transoceanic canal for 50 years, renewable for another 50 years. The man behind HKND Group was Wang Jing, a Chinese telecom billionaire with no track record in infrastructure on this scale. The concession came with sweeping powers. HKND could design, finance, construct, and operate not just the canal, but associated ports, free trade zones, and even airports. The route would stretch 278 kilometers from the Pacific to the Caribbean, 3 times longer than the Panama Canal. The projected cost was up to $50 billion, more than 4 times Nicaragua's entire gross domestic product. There was no public bidding, no competitive process, and almost no debate. Law 840 gave HKND vast tax exemptions and authority over land expropriation along the canal corridor. Critics warned that the deal handed unprecedented control to a foreign private company, with little oversight and enormous economic risk. Wang Jing promised to transform Nicaragua's future, but the sheer scale and secrecy surrounding the concession sent shockwaves through the region. Stories like this one reveal just how much happens beneath the surface of world events. A single project can reshape trade, shift alliances, and trigger quiet battles between superpowers, all far from the headlines. If you want to keep up with the forces that drive global finance and geopolitics, take a second to subscribe to Fiscal Nation. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an investigation. We dig into the real stories behind the numbers, who benefits, who loses, and why it matters. Every week we break down the deals, rivalries, and hidden moves that shape the world economy. Don't just watch history unfold, understand what is really at stake. Subscribe now and join a community that looks beyond the surface. Let's get back to the story. A canal slicing across Nicaragua would do more than move ships. It would redraw the map of global shipping, creating a second choke point between the Atlantic and the Pacific, one no longer controlled by the United States. For over a century, the Panama Canal has been a linchpin of American influence. Nearly 6% of world trade passes through its locks, and its location gives Washington quiet leverage over global commerce. The idea of a rival canal, managed by a Chinese company with a concession that would last a century, raised alarms well beyond Managua. On paper, the project was pitched as a private venture, promising jobs and growth for Nicaragua. But the sheer scale, $50 billion, 3 times longer than Panama's and 4 times Nicaragua's entire gross domestic product, did not add up for most commercial analysts. No major shipping line had committed. No global bank had signed on. The numbers only made sense if the canal served a strategic purpose, giving China a foothold in the Western Hemisphere and an option to bypass United States' influence routes. Observers noted the pattern. In Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Indian Ocean, Chinese firms had built ports, railways, and pipelines, projects that often doubled as tools of geopolitical influence. The Nicaragua Canal fit this playbook, even if Beijing kept its distance publicly. For the United States, the prospect of a Chinese-controlled waterway in Central America was more than an economic question. It was a direct challenge to a sphere of influence defined since the Monroe Doctrine. The canal, if completed, would shift the balance of power in the Americas, with ripple effects for decades to come. Official statements from Washington rarely mentioned the canal directly. Instead, US diplomats stressed the importance of transparency, environmental safeguards, and respect for property rights in Nicaragua. State Department investment reports flagged the sweeping expropriation powers granted by Law 840 and the lack of public consultation, language that seasoned bankers and insurers recognized as a warning. In closed-door meetings, American officials described Nicaragua as a high-risk environment for major infrastructure. The message was clear without ever being explicit. Any Western institution backing this project would be exposed to reputational and regulatory danger. Major US and European banks quietly withdrew interest. No global insurer stepped forward to underwrite construction or political risk. Export credit agencies and multilateral lenders bound by strict governance and environmental standards found little to support. Even the prospect of Chinese capital failed to reassure the financial world, especially with Beijing keeping its distance. The canal's risk profile soared, and the absence of credible international backers became impossible to ignore. While public rhetoric focused on environmental reviews and the rule of law, the real pressure came through the arteries of global finance. In a world where access to capital depends on perceived legitimacy, Washington's skepticism was enough to freeze the flow. The project's $50 billion price tag became a mirage, and the canal's fate shifted from an engineering challenge to financial impossibility. Wang Jing's entire plan depended on his fortune staying intact. In the summer of 2015, the Chinese stock market crashed. Wang's stake in Beijing Xinhui, his main asset, lost billions in value almost overnight. Reports estimated his personal wealth dropped by as much as 85%, from over $10 billion to less than $2 billion. With no deep-pocketed state banks backing him, the capital meant for Nicaragua simply evaporated. Meanwhile, just across the isthmus, Panama cut the ribbon on a new set of Neo-Panamax locks in June 2016. The expanded canal could now handle ships carrying over 13,000 containers, more than double its previous capacity. Shipping lines and investors took notice. Suddenly, Panama offered the same economies of scale the Nicaragua project had promised, but with none of the risk. The business case for a $50 billion rival collapsed. Without credible financing, and with Panama's expansion soaking up global shipping demand, the Nicaraguan canal became little more than a fading promise. From the first announcement, resistance grew along the canal's path. Campesino organizations and indigenous communities organized wave after wave of protests, rallying in rural villages and marching on Managua. Over the years, movement leaders tallied more than 90 separate demonstrations, road blockades, sit-ins, and mass marches that drew thousands at a time. Their banners warned of forced displacement, the destruction of Lake Nicaragua, and the loss of ancestral land. Environmental groups sounded alarms about irreversible damage to the country's largest freshwater reserve. Scientists and international NGOs reviewed the environmental and social impact assessment and found gaping holes, with missing baseline data, unanswered questions about water quality, and entire sections calling for further study. Critics accused HKND and the government of ignoring these warnings, pushing forward without real consultation. By 2018, the offices of HKND in Managua were shuttered, and the project was all but abandoned. In May 2024, the National Assembly officially revoked the canal concession, erasing Law 840 from the books. The century-old dream ended not with construction, but with a legal repeal, driven as much by relentless grassroots opposition as by vanished financing. Today, the canal remains a symbol, grand ambitions crushed by global rivalry. As China and the US compete for influence, even the boldest projects can vanish overnight. In a world where infrastructure is power, every unfinished canal leaves a question. Who will shape the next crossroads? Share your thoughts in the comments.